What's the difference between myofibrillar protein synthesis and mitochondrial protein synthesis?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Often in these studies that we do, we report myofibrillar protein synthesis rates and mitochondrial protein synthesis rates. So when we, in order to do this research, we need to take a muscle biopsy. So we take a small piece of muscle, and that piece of muscle will contain thousands of different proteins. But basically in the lab, we take that piece of muscle and we do a bunch of steps to sort of process it, and we can basically isolate a myofibrillar enriched protein fraction. So myofibrillar proteins are the proteins of the myofibril. Proteins like actin and myosin, proteins involved in muscle contraction. And there'll be other regulatory proteins like troponin and tropomyosin. But these are an important fraction to look at because, again, it's these force-generating proteins. And the myofibrillar proteins are also the most abundant in muscle. So around 60% of total muscle protein is myofibrillar protein.
Wow.
So that's why we look at that because, again, it's these force-producing proteins. And if you're an athlete, then you care about the force-producing capacity of your muscle. So when we think about strength, for example, we think about these proteins. And because they're so abundant, they also, they contribute to the hypertrophic effect, right? When our muscles grow bigger, it's largely because we're increasing the amount of contractile protein in muscle. But the mitochondrial proteins, they represent a much smaller proportion of total muscle. So maybe about 5% of total muscle protein is these mitochondrial proteins. So these could be proteins involved in the respiratory chain, for example. Like I said, there's a much smaller total amount of mitochondrial protein than myofibrillar, but the idea of looking at this fraction is that, particularly within the context of endurance exercise, we tend to think about mitochondria. So if we're, seeing a rise in the rate of mitochondrial protein synthesis, that could be a signal that maybe this intervention, be it nutrition or exercise, is important for eliciting mitochondrial biogenesis, right? So an increase in the size and or number of mitochondria